let's go. We're going to go to from 840. That's where we're going to go from. Yesterday we looked at the concept of the red heifer, this incredible paradox that it makes people pure and it makes people impure depending on whether you're on the receiving end or whether you're on the giving end. Then over here, the Torah is going to talk about who becomes impure. What is this impurity? Where's it coming from? If it comes from, it comes from touching a dead body. But let's go. There's the particular verse I want to deal with. Verse number 14 over here. Yeah, very good. It says like this: Zois haTorah Adam ki yomus ba'oil. So the simple understanding of the pasuk over here is coming to teach you that if somebody dies in a tent or any kind of a building, so kol habayla oil v'chol asher boil yitma shivas yomim, that the spiritual impurity that's generated by death is going to permeate the whole area. Anything that's covered, right? So if you've got somebody who dies in a tent, it doesn't matter how big the tent is, it doesn't matter which part of the tent somebody else is standing in, they're going to become spiritually impure by the fact that the roof over the dead body is now going to circulate that spiritual impurity. The truth of the matter is today, because we don't have a red heifer, so all of us are in a state of spiritual impurity. Probably all of us are in a state of the highest spiritual impurity, which is this tumas meis that we're talking about over here, the spiritual impurity of the dead. And there's nothing we can do about it. Which means that the problem is like this. In the olden days, you could purify yourself through the red heifer, and it's an 8-day period, 7 days worth of purification. On the 8th day, you become pure.
Why can't we do this now? Because
we don't have a red heifer. You need a temple in order to make this one work. Right. Interestingly enough, they once asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the greatest halachic authorities from the previous generation. They asked him whether it was correct to start trying to make a red heifer. I mean, I'm sure there are all kinds of agricultural and genetic ways that you can get a red heifer, bring a red heifer into the world. And Rav Moshe Feinstein said something. He didn't think that it was worth investing a lot of time and effort over. He says, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends a Mashiach, so for sure he's going to send everything that's required in order to make the Messianic era work the way that it's supposed to work, which means that he said it's inconceivable that God would send the Mashiach and then there'll be this hiatus because there'll be no red heifer. Like, oh gosh, what are we going to do now? Now we're stuck, and it doesn't work like that. The problem with the red heifer, of course, is that when you've got a cow which can't have, it can only have one hair that's not the right color. If it's got 2 hairs or more, then that's not called a red heifer anymore. The problem is that as cows get bigger, which means you can have cows that are smaller, that are first born, that have this reddy color, all the hairs are this reddy color. But as they get older, as happens very often with children as well, their hair color changes a little bit. And you don't. Well, it's got to be, if my memory serves me correct, it's got to be in its 2nd year of being alive. Right, which means that it's not. There are all kinds of criteria that have to be met over here in order for this cow to be able to be used as a red heifer. According to tradition, there have only ever been 9 red heifers that were dealt with. The first one was done by Moshe Rabbeinu, and a little bit of Moshe's red heifer was added into all the other red heifers that were subsequently used for this purification process, because Moshe Rabbeinu was the only person who truly understood the dimensions behind the red heifer, the spiritual dimensions. Interestingly enough, Shimon HaTzadik, who is now, that's very late, that's going into the beginning of the 2nd temple period. Shimon HaTzadik actually slaughtered, he used 2 red heifers in his lifetime. That was something very, very rare. And it was rare to find one. You can imagine we're talking about, from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until the time of Shimon HaTzadik, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. And over that space of time, there have only ever been 9 red heifers that have been utilized in this purification process. And Chazal say the sages that in Mitzvah Hashem, when the Mashiach comes, that's the 10th one. There will only ever be 10. And that 10th one is the one that's going to be introduced by the Mashiach, and then things are going to be great. When the Mashiach comes, one of the things that's going to be a pretty fundamental dimension of the very onset of the Messianic era is the fact that we're going to have to go through this purification process. And that means, again, it means being sprinkled with these waters on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then going to the mikveh on the 8th day and becoming pure, and then that's Mitzvah Hashem. Then we'll stay in a state of purity.
Who does these rituals? A Kohen Gadol, yeah?
Not the Kohen Gadol, a Kohen. Not
When
necessarily.
The Mashiach perform all the rituals.
The Mashiach is not going to be a Kohen, right? Which is it's a technical problem, right? Which means that the Mashiach is going to come. The Mashiach is going to come from the tribe of David, right? I mean, he's the tribe of Yehuda. I'm sorry, but from the house of David, and that's going to be his function. His function, the function of the Mashiach is going to be the king. The Kohen Gadol's function is the spiritual dimension. The king has to take care of the physical dimension of the Jewish nation, and the Kohen Gadol is going to take care of the spiritual dimension.
The Mashiach will be a direct descendant of David HaMelech.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, this balance of power, something very fundamental, it really is, that you can't have all the power vested in one person, which means that the king cannot be the Kohen Gadol as well, because if he is, then that means that everything now rests in the hands of one person, and that's not good. There's a sense of checks and balances, which means that if the king is not behaving in the way that he's supposed to behave, then the Kohen Gadol can try to right things, and the other way around as well. If the Kohen Gadol's not doing,
humility concept,
maybe, yeah, not having everything in the hands of one person. That's why it says that was a mistake that the Chashmonaim made, right, at the time of Hanukkah, that they were all Kohanim, and ultimately they took the monarchy upon themselves, and that's why the Gemara says that the house of the Chashmonaim died out. And the reason that's given for their dying out was because they took upon themselves too much. Not immediately. At the point when they were fighting against the Greeks, of course they had to take control. It was as simple as that. But post-victory, they decided to keep the monarchy with themselves, and at that point that was something they should never have done. Right?
That's like the Hazonians, yeah?
Yeah. So here, the Torah learns out something, the sages learn out something absolutely beautiful from verse number 14. V'zois HaTorah, Adam ki yomus ba'oil. What does it mean that this is the Torah, Adam ki yomus ba'oil, somebody who's going to die in the tent? So it says in the words of the sages that somebody has to be able to be meimis atzmoi, that somebody has to be prepared to give up his life to learn Torah. Now, what does that mean? Baruch Hashem, that doesn't mean that we have to sanctify God's name by literally giving up our lives, but we have to make sacrifices in order to be able to learn Torah, which means like this. Everybody here, I don't have to tell you, the sacrifice involved in being here, learning in the yeshiva, is coming at the expense of all kinds of things, whether it's secular studies, whether it's work, whatever it is, right?
You do it 100%, yeah. You've got to
for sure, but it's more than that. Even if a person is working, they still have to dedicate time to learning. The Chofetz Chaim had a very, very beautiful story. He used to tell like this. He said, what does it mean? Adam ki meimis atzmoi, somebody who kills himself, someone who's prepared to die in order to learn Torah. He says like this. There was once a very, very wealthy man. Had a very, very successful store. And every day after davening, he would come to the store and he would work in the store until it got dark, and then he would go home, and they've made lots of money. He was a very, very, very wealthy man. Anyway, one day he gets up in the morning, he's on his way to shul, and he happens to glance into the mirror, and he sees in the mirror that his beard is all white, and his hair is all white, and he looks at himself, he says, where did the time go? This is terrible, I used to be young, and I'm not so young anymore. And he says, what am I going to do? I'm going to get upstairs at the age of 120, and what am I going to show to God? All my receipts for, how much coffee I sold or how much rice I sold? That's no good. So he says, I'm going to accept it by myself from today, that after davening in the morning, I'm going to spend 2 hours learning, and then I'm going to go to the store. So he doesn't say anything to anybody, and davening finishes, and he sits down in the base of medrash, and he starts to learn. Anyway, his wife's in the store, and the store is filling up with customers, and of course she doesn't know how to run the store properly, and she's waiting for her husband, and he's not there. So finally she calls to one of her servants and says, go and find, wherever he is, go and find the master, where is he? So this fellow goes out, is looking all over the place, doesn't see him anywhere, comes back, he says, I can't find him, I don't know. Anyway, after 2 hours, the store owner turns up, the husband turns up, and his wife, of course, in the subtle, understated way that wives do, starts to shout at him, where were you? What's going on? We got a store full of customers, they're going to go somewhere else. He says, it's fine, I'm here now, it's all right. And he starts having his busy day's worth of commerce. Next morning, same thing again. He sits down and starts learning after he's finished davening, and the wife is there at the store, the place is filling up with customers, and she sends out the servant, go find your master, and he goes looking, and this time he thinks to himself, you know what, maybe he's still in shul. So he goes off to the shul and he sees the master sitting over there learning, and he goes rushing back and he tells the wife, it's okay, I found him, he's in the shul, he's learning. Anyway, after 2 hours he appears again, and the wife, of course, starts shouting at him again, what are you doing? The store's full of customers, how can you do this? What do you think you're doing? So he says to his wife like this, he says, listen, let's imagine right now that the Malach HaMovis, the angel of death, comes into the store to take me. What are you going to tell him? You're going to tell him, hey, not now, we've got a store full of customers, please come back later on when it's quieter? No. When the angel of death comes, that's it, he comes. Finished. Says the husband to the wife, what you have to do is you have to imagine for the first 2 hours of the workday, every day, consider me to be dead. The only difference between the Malach HaMovis and me is that I'm going to come back every day after 2 hours. I'm going to come back to life and I'm going to be here at the store. Says the Chofetz Chaim, the most beautiful idea over here. Being prepared to kill yourself to be able to learn Torah, that doesn't mean that we've got to die. Baruch Hashem, right? The Torah says, V'chai behem, we're supposed to live inside of the Torah, not to die inside of the Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to die. But what we have to do is we have to be prepared to make sacrifices in order to be able to make that happen. And there are always sacrifices to be made. Everybody here know just as well as I do. Here, being here right now in this yeshiva, everybody sacrificed in order to be here. Mitzvah Hashem, if you leave the yeshiva and you go and establish your homes and you go and you establish your businesses and you're working, you're also going to have to establish time in your day to sit down and learn. Where's that time going to come from? Let's say for argument's sake, you set up a business and it's running very nicely, and every morning you go to daven, and then you go to work, and then you've got to come home, and you've got your wife, and you've got your children, and you need to learn. When are you going to do that? Which is, the learning has got to come at the expense of something. There's only a limited amount of time within the day.
If you do it 100%, and you become a rabbi, and then everything's...
You know what? You don't have to become a rabbi. You really don't. The idea what the Chofetz Chaim is saying is something much, much more basic than that. Which is that somebody wants to become a rabbi and dedicate their entire life to spiritual pursuits. So in a certain way, they've got it easy, right? Because they don't have to make the sacrifices that somebody who's working and has a wife and has children and has to learn. Because it's understood that rabbis need to learn, right? And it's understood that rabbis, when they prepare the shiurim, so they have to study and they have to investigate, and they're always in a state of growth. But what about somebody who's running you're working from 9 to 5 every day, you've got to daven in the morning, you've got to spend some time with your wife, you've got to spend some time with your children, and you've got to learn as well. Which means that time that's being spent learning is going to come at the expense, normally, at the quality time that you would spend together with your wife. And yet it's got to be done. And that's really what the Chofetz Chaim is saying. That if you're prepared to make that sacrifice, then that means that you're prepared to give up your life in order to learn Torah. That's the ultimate sacrifice of all, no? What's Pshat? Pshat is like this. Torah, how many times have you heard me say this, right? Judaism is the most realistic religion in the world. Nobody's suggesting that it's not right to have a livelihood. No one is suggesting that that's not what a person should do. But it's got to be juggled. There's a juggling act over here. I see with people who don't have that connection to Torah. So they work very hard, and they come home and they spend time with their wives and they spend time with their children, and then they go back to work again the next day, and they've got a very busy day and it's very full. A person who's dedicating his life to growing, spiritual growth, has to do all of that, plus they have to learn Torah as well. I'm not suggesting, right, that one is that you should do this and not that. That's not the idea. The idea is that what the Torah is teaching us is that you've got to juggle the two.
But the thing I'm saying is you can make your livelihood through Torah, because you could become a rabbi or a sage.
A person can do that, but again, that's not right for every single person.
Of course.
Right, which means that if that's right for a person, then that, like I said, in a certain way they've got it easy. I mean, financially, normally they don't have it so easy. And, people that normally go out into the commercial world normally do better than people involved in education and in rabbinics, unless you've got some very fancy, position somewhere. But so that's part of the sacrifice, though, which means that if a person wants to become a rabbi, and a person wants to go into education, and a person wants to go either to teach or to become a rabbi or to become a dayan, then that person knows that they're going to do that at the expense of being able to make more money in the outside world. Yeah, for sure. Again, each one according to what they need to do, but each side, each side needs to know that there's a sacrifice coming from each side. My personal feeling is that in a certain paradoxical way, I think it's easier to go into the spiritual realms and to have less money than to go into the physical realms and have to deal with this incredible overload of having to make a parnasa and of having to build a relationship with your wife and having to build your relationship with your children and to build your relationship with Hashem. It's not so simple to do. But here, that's the beauty of what's going on over here is, which is even inside of something which is pretty esoterical, this idea of spiritual impurity and being impure and purifying ourselves, even with inside of that, we're being given the most incredible practical dimension, which means that a person's got to be prepared to sacrifice in order to be able to grow in the spiritual realms. There's no easy way of doing it. They say in the name of the Vilna Gaon, that the Vilna Gaon used to say that everybody wants to know Shas, that's to know the Talmud, know the Talmud overnight. He says, and they want to sleep that night as well. Which means that we are such a bunch of not prepared to make any kind of effort, Nix, that we end up. That's how we end up. We end up we want everything, but we don't want to put in the effort required in order to get there. This pasuk over here is teaching us that it doesn't work like that. In the spiritual realms, here, what does it say? The fum tsara agra. The more you put in, the more you're going to get out. The greater the effort, the greater the reward. Or in our terms, right? The fum tsara agra is no pain, no gain. Right? In spiritual terms, a person's got to be able to sweat tears in order to be able to try and understand the Torah, and in order to be able to find the time to be able to understand the Torah as well. Here, let's go over the page. We're gonna leave behind the concept of the spiritual impurity, and we're gonna move into something which is really terribly sad, and we're gonna see, of course, how the Jewish people react. Right, we've got this propensity to react in the wrong way, right? So here, let's have a look in chapter 20. The Avoy b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar tzin b'chodesh harishon. This is the first month of the year. What's the first month of the year? Nisan, right? V'yeshev ha'am b'kadesh, and we've come to a place called Kadesh. V'tomos shom Miriam, and Miriam dies over there.
The first of Nisan.
It's interesting. It doesn't say over here what day of the month it is. If you hold on, we'll see later on in this week's Parsha, Aaron dies, and over there we're going to be given a day and a month. And interestingly enough, by Moshe Rabbeinu, we're not given a day and we're not given a month either. We're not given anything, right? Even though we know when Moshe Rabbeinu did die, yeah. But nevertheless, it's not mentioned in the Torah at all. But over here, it's interesting that Miriam, it's mentioned the month that she dies in, but it's not mentioned the day.
That means come across who is Miriam?
Miriam is Aaron's sister. Okay. Right? Now, Miriam is a very, very important person for several reasons. First of all, she's one of the 7 female prophets. She is the leader of the women from the Exodus of Egypt until now, this moment of going into the land of Israel.
And she checked on her little brother when he was...
She certainly looked after her brother to make sure that he was going to be okay when he was put into the Nile. She's now 126 years old, and she's going to die. Now, one of the most important details about Miriam is something that I didn't mention yet, is that in Miriam's merit, the water was brought to the Jewish people in the desert. That's going to have a lot of bearing over here in a moment. We're going to see why it's so important. But what does it say? Very terse. V'tomos sham Miriam v'tekaver sham. Miriam dies and she's buried over there. Not very much detail given at all. And then the next verse, verse number 2, and now we're going to begin to understand what is the connection of verse number 2 to verse number 1. V'lo haya mayim le'eda, there was no water. Vayikalu al Moshe val Aaron, and the people came. Vayikalu means they kind of sort of like, jostled their way around Moshe and Aaron. Verse number 3. Vayorev ha'am im Moshe vayomu. You know what? Hold on. Just before we get to verse number 3, does anybody see anything over here that's missing? Aside from the water, which is obviously missing, right? Do you see in the description, or to give you a little bit of a clue, in the lack of description in the death of Miriam, do you see what do you see? It's so obviously missing over here. Well, you would expect the Jewish people would mourn the death of Miriam. There's no mention over here at all. Nothing. What's Pshat? We're now 40 years on, right? Which means that the people that are gathered around are fine. Okay, Miriam, she's important. She's a significant personality. But she's 126 years old.
So what?
So I don't know. So what's that's a little bit callous, but it's more like a
celebration of her life.
It's more like a case of it's a case of she lived a nice, long, great life. 126 years. She managed to do incredible things during her lifetime, and but everybody's got to die. There's no sense of mourning. There's no sense of despair at the idea of losing somebody of the stature of Miriam. There's not going to be another Miriam over here. We don't have anywhere. It doesn't say anywhere from now on. It doesn't talk about some woman who takes over the position of Miriam.
But we have lots more great women in the Jewish religion after Miriam.
Of course, but again, we're talking about right now the Jewish people in the desert as they are right now. So fine. They've got Moshe and Aaron, but here, let's make a little cheshbon over here. Let's make a little calculation. Miriam is 126, Aaron is 123, Moshe is 120. If you're going to be callous enough to say that, well, she's 126 and you got to go sometime, well, what is that going to say about Aaron? And what's that going to say about Moshe? Which means that all of them, presumably, are coming towards the end of their lives. How come there is no sense? First of all, why is there no sense of gratitude to Miriam for everything that she did?
Like with Parshat Yosef, come Dor Chadash, and they didn't know.
Oh, right. Which means what? Of course they knew. They knew perfectly well. Of course they knew, right?
Her, but different breed, a different generation.
She hasn't impacted on me personally, right? The last time we come across Miriam making an absolute impact on the Jewish people is after the splitting of the Red Sea, where we see that she takes the women off and she sings with them and they have prophecy together, and it's a very, very special moment. The rest of the time, over the last 40 years, what's Miriam been doing? She's been leading the Jewish people, the ladies. That's been her task. It says over here, in the Medrash when it says, V'yikalu al Moshe v'al Aaron, they gathered around Aaron and Moshe. What were Aaron and Moshe doing? They were sitting shiva. Miriam has just died, right? It's their sister. When a sibling, like, you should know from these things, but when a sibling passes away, then you got to sit shiva for that sibling.
Any family sits shiva, yeah.
Close family, right? Parents and siblings.
You go to the shiva house, you don't actually sit here.
Right, but parents and siblings, the person has to sit shiva. That's what they're doing, and they're coming now, and they're gathering around, and they're going to complain about the fact that they don't have any water. So it's interesting. They're not being judged over here for coming, even though Moshe and Aaron are sitting shiva, because if you've got no water, you've got no water, right? You can't wait 7 days, right, for Moshe and Aaron to get up from shiva before they come and they say, by the way, we haven't drunk anything for the last 7 days. You can't do that. You need to drink the whole time, right? So they come and they gather around. I saw once an interesting idea. It's almost like a midah keneged midah. Again, we're back to this concept of this incredible balance that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world with. What does it say? They didn't cry. Which means there's a lack of tears, there's a lack of water on their behalf. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu took away their water. Midah keneged midah, measure for measure. You didn't produce water, right? You didn't cry. Therefore, I'm going to take your water away. And then you'll realize just how great Miriam was. You'll realize what it was that Miriam meant to the Jewish people.
Was it Miriam who merited there being water in her lifetime?
Yeah. Yeah, which is interesting enough. The water, the source of the water that followed them through the desert was called the Be'er Miriam, the well of Miriam. It was a stone of some kind, and it traveled together with them.
What's that mean, the water of Miriam?
The well of Miriam, and they would whenever they camped somewhere, the princes of the tribes would go up to this stone, and they would take their sticks and they would draw a line from the stone around the whole of their particular encampment, and then the water would start flowing through. And they would be surrounded by this like little stream of water, which was fresh water that they could come and drink. Obviously, it's completely miraculous. And that was this thing is called the Be'er Miriam, the water of Miriam. Interesting enough, if you want to know whatever happened to it, according to the Kabbalists, the well of Miriam, this Be'er, this stone of Miriam, ended up in the Kinneret. Apparently, according to the Kabbalists, there's I don't know, ways of identifying the water out of the Kinneret. If you drink from this particular water, it can give you insights into Torah that they're not available to other people.
Hey, let's go and take a day trip to the Kinneret.
Yeah, the problem is that nowadays, first of all, the Kinneret's pretty low, and secondly, what you'll probably be drinking is some kind of layer of petrol that's come out of the motorboats that go whizzing around over there. It will certainly give you insights, that's for sure. You'll probably end up hallucinating, but I don't know if it's going to give you exactly what it is that you're looking for. But it's interesting that it ended up in the Kinneret. The Kinneret is a very, very spiritual body of water. Something very, first of all, it used to be the only real source of water here in Israel. And secondly, it's got some incredible spiritual dimension to it. Tiberias is a very spiritual city. Sitting on top of Tiberias, of course, is Tzfat, which means that it's a very, very, very esoteric area of the world. It's a very Kabbalistic area of the world. And it's very apt that this well of Miriam, this Be'er Miriam, ends up in the Kinneret of all places. I think it's very, it's very apt that that's where it is. So it says like this: Vayoy va'am Moshe. Verse number 3. They're now fighting with Moshe. Vayomu le'movalu gavanu b'gvachenu lifnei Hashem. Yeah, what a surprise, right? And they come to Moshe and they say like this: if only we would have died like everybody else died. How did everybody else die? So either they got wiped out when they tried to go into the land of Israel and they shouldn't have done, or they ended up dying every year on the 9th of Av, or they ended up being swallowed in the ground, or whatever it is, right? But they don't want to die like this. You should know something. I don't have any personal experience from this whatsoever, but apparently death by thirst is the most terrible way to die.
Yeah, by the other, suppose you hallucinate.
I mean, but until you, I imagine when you start hallucinating, that's probably good because it means you're not with it anymore. But until you get to that moment, apparently it is something which is so terribly, it's so terribly painful, and it's something which is so that what they're coming to Moshe and they're saying any other way to die would have been preferable than dying like this.
Didn't Moshe hit a rock with his
Oh no, we're gonna get there. Why did you bring us to this desert? Lamut sham anachnu virenu. Why did you bring us to die over here? Here, look what it says, verse number 5. Why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to this terrible place? This awful place? There's nothing here. There's no grain. There's no figs. There's no grapes. There's no pomegranates. There's no water. Now, I don't know. Do you understand? First of all, there's something very strange about this sentence. There really is. They're standing in front of Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? What are they missing right now? Water. So why on earth are they saying it's a place with no grain and no figs and no grapes and no pomegranates? Oh, and by the way, there's no water to drink either. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Surely start with the water. That's the most important thing.
They heard about.
He also said no olives or no dates.
All things that in the land of Israel.
No here, right? All of the things that the land of Israel is famous for. But right now, in a minute we'll talk about why are they talking about that. But right now, my question is, why on earth don't they begin with the water? That's the most important thing, isn't it? So here, what are they saying? They're saying like this, something very, very simple, very obvious. We understand that when we're coming through the desert, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to keep us alive, right? So how does he keep us alive? He gives us water. Which means if the water has stopped, what does that mean? No. What does that mean? Not practically. What does it mean geographically? We've arrived, right? We've arrived in the land of Israel. If we've arrived in the land of Israel, well, excuse me, but where are the grains? Right? Where are the figs? Where are the pomegranates? Where are the grapes? Really, and if we're not in the land, listen, that's what it's saying. If we're not in the land of Israel, so where's the water? You can't have both over here. That's what they're saying. Why did you bring us to this terrible place? It doesn't have any of the things that the land of Israel is famous for, which means we can't be in the land of Israel right now. Umayim ayin lishdot, and there's no water to drink.
It's a valid complaint. Besides the
100%.
lack of understanding, the lack of faith in Hashem, it's a valid complaint.
100%, which is why we don't see the Jewish people being punished over here. Again, maybe they didn't come in the most respectful way, right? But you know what? They're scared. They're scared that their children are going to die, and their flocks are going to die, and they're going to die. I mean, they have every justification to be scared, which is why we don't see anywhere HaKadosh Baruch Hu passing judgment on the fact that they came to complain about the water. Afterwards, we'll see what happens.
It isn't from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because they never cried for me. He stopped supplying them.
Oh, so but they're saying that they're not right now. They're not sensitive enough to pick up they're not picking up the nuances over here. They're saying like this. Okay, Miriam died, which means what? This is the end of the old guard. Right? They know that Moshe is not going to take them into the land of Israel, and they know that they're almost on the edge of the land of Israel. And now Miriam dies, which means what?
I assume they're in Israel.
That's it. Here, we've arrived. Okay, very soon. Aaron's going to die, and Moshe's going to die, and everyone's going to go into the land of Israel. But hold on a second. If there's no water, then surely God must be saying that where we are right now must be the land of Israel. But it's not, because what were we promised about the land of Israel? Everything, right?
Milk and honey.
A land flowing with milk and honey. There's nothing there. What do they call it? A makom ara hazeh. It is a terrible, awful place. And then they're saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but if none of these things are here, then what does it mean? It means that we're not in the land of Israel. If we're not in the land of Israel, where's the water? You can't have both. And what do Moshe and Aaron, what do? They fall on their faces in subjugation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the emes is that they know that the Jewish people are correct in their complaint. They know that. Again, we don't see Moshe Rabbeinu censuring the Jewish people in any way and telling them that it's, how could you possibly question that there's no water? God knows what he's doing. You need water. That's the most basic commodity of all.
They should trust in the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will provide for them.
Here, so I have a little kasher on the Jewish people, right? Based on what you've just said. A little question. There were other things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to the Jewish people, no? Which means that there was water, and there was manna, and there were the clouds of glory. According to Chazal, according to the sages, it says like this: the water was given in the merit of Miriam, the clouds of glory were given in the merit of Aaron, and the manna was given in the merit of Moshe.
Where's the manna?
What they ate every day, right? Which means like this: let's just stop and work it out together, no? The Jewish people are there in the desert and they've run out of water. Okay, that's a pretty big thing, right? But did the manna stop falling? No. Every morning they get their manna, right? Did the clouds of glory disappear? No, they're still there. Which means that the Jewish people, if they would have been looking properly, not consumed with fear, they would have said, hold on a second, there's something weird going on over here, no? Because the clouds of glory are still here, and the manna is still here, which means obviously we haven't reached the land of Israel right now, which means that obviously the lack of water is something to do with us and not to do with God. And then they should have come to Moshe and they just said, Moshe, what did we do wrong?
All this time in the desert, I mean, you have the Kohanut, which sort of has been developing over 40 years. And we know that Moshe has been sort of tutoring Yoshua when the time comes. But what about the people? Haven't they been sitting around and studying, the law?
Yeah. The
Studying-
people have
Don't
been.
they have any Yiddishkeit? They've been just...
The people have been living in a completely unnatural spiritual bubble, which means that they're not. Nobody over here is breaking their heads trying to understand nuances within halacha. We've spoken about this in the past, right? When halacha is not known, so what do? You just go to Moshe. That's all. And if Moshe, hold on a second, if Moshe doesn't know, what does he do? Goes to God. There's no concept. They're living in a. I'm trying to be very careful with the way I'm describing this, but I think maybe the best way to describe it is they're living in a state of spiritual complacency. They don't have to try to understand anything. It's been given to them on a silver platter, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's passing on to Moshe. Moshe's passing on to the Jewish people. You understood it? Great. You didn't understand it? Go back and listen to it again. You'll understand it.
One thing I don't understand is if Hashem's preparing to put his people into the promised land, why hasn't he been preparing them?
Oh, so here says the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and it's based on earlier authorities, which means you now sound like the Netziv. You start looking like him, and then we're really going to be in good shape, right? But in the meantime, that's not bad, right? What does the Netziv say? He says the most incredible thing. He says for 39 years in the desert, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is leading the Jewish people in this completely unnatural bubble of spirituality. It's completely not normal the way that they live. Says the Netziv, the last year that they were in the desert, HaKadosh Baruch Hu now begins to make a little bit of a transition period. One of the things that he brings as a proof is that the whole time in the desert, Moshe Rabbeinu is normally carrying his stick. He's got this very, very special stick that he found in Yisro's garden. That's the one that brought the 10 plagues, and that's a stick that split the sea, and that's a stick which represents God's might down here in this world. Says the Netziv, for the last year that the Jews were in the desert, that stick wasn't held by Moshe. It was put in the Ohel Moed. It was put away, and their existence was the beginning of something a little bit more normative. Because otherwise, you're quite right. What are they going to do? They're going to go from the spiritual bubble into the reality, physical reality of living in the land of Israel. How on earth are they going to make that transition? Here. Let's look. Verse number 7, verse number 8. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, here they've got a good complaint over here. It's a valid complaint, yeah. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, take your stick and go and show the people that you're going to bring water together. You're going to bring water out of the stone by speaking to it. Now, we all understand, I hope, right? We all of us understand, that what do you need the stick for? Well, if God's saying, go and hit the stone, we understand why God says take the stick. And if God is saying, go and speak to the stone, so what does he need the stick for? It's completely superfluous. According to the Netziv, the answer is absolutely clear. Says the Netziv, that what's happening now is something which is supernatural. We're going back into that bubble of unnatural reality, and for that, what do you need? You need the symbol of the Jewish people's relationship with God in the unnatural, in the supernatural realms, not in the natural realms. Which means like this, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's telling Moshe Rabbeinu, you're about to do something which is completely and absolutely miraculous. There is no logical, rational explanation for it, and for that you have to take the stick, because the children of Israel need to see that what's about to happen now is something which is not normal. This is not something which exists inside of the world of nature. That's what he tells him. And now you have to go and speak to the stone, right, to this rock, and you're going to bring the water out of the rock. Which rock is God talking about? He's talking about the Be'er Miriam, this well of Miriam. Good. But we're going to stop over here. Imit Hashem, yeah. Otherwise you won't come back tomorrow. Imit Hashem, tomorrow we got to see what happens, because of course everything spirals out of control. Yeah. What's new, huh? We'll get there. Imit Hashem.